The warm Sunday afternoon sun shone down on Pearl Avenue as 78-year-old Rose Johnson slowly made her way back from church. Her arthritis was acting up more than usual today, making each step a small challenge, but Rose wasn't one to complain. She'd lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years and knew every crack in the sidewalk, every neighbor's face, and every stray cat that wandered these streets. Rose wore her favorite lavender dress and matching hat, her Sunday best. In one hand, she clutched her worn leather Bible, and in the other, a small paper bag containing leftover cookies from the church social. She planned to enjoy them with her afternoon tea while watching her favorite game show. As she approached the corner of Pearl and Magnolia, Rose noticed something unusual. 2 police cars were parked haphazardly near Mrs. Wilson's house across the street. Rose paused, adjusting her glasses to get a better look. She could see 3 officers surrounding a young black man who had his hands up. The young man looked frightened, and Rose felt her heart sink. "Lord have mercy," she whispered to herself. Rose had lived through the civil rights movement. She'd marched with Dr. King in her youth and had seen both progress and painful setbacks in her lifetime. The scene unfolding across the street brought back memories she'd rather forget. Without thinking twice, Rose began making her way across the street. Her son always told her not to get involved in police matters, but Rose couldn't stand by when someone might need help. As she approached, she could hear the officers speaking harshly to the young man. "I don't care what you say you're doing here. This is a nice neighborhood, and we got a call about someone suspicious." "That's you," said the tallest officer, his hand resting on his holster. "I'm just waiting for my aunt," the young man replied, his voice shaking slightly. "She lives right there. I can call her right now." "Sure you are," said another officer with a smirk. "And I'm the President of the United States." Rose reached the edge of the yard and called out, "Excuse me, officers. Is everything all right?" All heads turned toward her. The young man's eyes widened with relief at seeing another person, while the officers looked annoyed at the interruption. "Ma'am, please return to the sidewalk. This is police business," the tall officer said firmly. Rose stood her ground. "I know this neighborhood better than most, and I'm wondering what seems to be the trouble here." The third officer, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we received a call about a suspicious person, and we're just doing our job. Please step back." Rose looked at the young man. "Are you Robert's nephew? You look just like him." The young man nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Thomas. I'm waiting for my Aunt Patricia. She lives right here," he gestured to the house behind him. Rose turned back to the officers. "This young man is telling the truth. Patricia Wilson is his aunt. She's lived here for at least 15 years. I've known her family a long time." The tall officer's expression hardened. "With all due respect, ma'am, we still need to verify his identity and reason for being here." "Then why don't you knock on Patricia's door and ask her?" Rose suggested, feeling her patience wearing thin. "We don't need you telling us how to do our job," the officer with the smirk said, taking a step toward Rose. "Now, I'm going to ask you one more time to step back, or we'll have to consider you as interfering with police business." Rose felt a flash of indignation. "Young man, I was standing up for what's right when you weren't even born yet. Don't you dare speak to me that way." The female officer put her hand on her colleague's arm, sensing the situation was escalating unnecessarily. But he shook her off. "ID now," the tall officer demanded of Thomas, ignoring Rose entirely. Thomas carefully reached for his back pocket and produced his wallet. His hands were trembling as he handed over his driver's license. Rose watched as the officers huddled together, examining the ID and speaking in low tones. She took this opportunity to move closer to Thomas. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas whispered back. Thank you for stopping. Of course, child. This isn't right. The officers returned, and the tall one handed back Thomas's ID with obvious reluctance. Story checks out. But next time, wait inside your aunt's house, not on the street looking suspicious. Before Thomas could respond, the smirking officer added, and you should be grateful we didn't take you in for questioning. Not everyone gets off this easy. Rose had heard enough. Excuse me, but what exactly did this young man do wrong? Standing on his aunt's property while being black is not a crime, last I checked. The tall officer turned to Rose, his face flushed with anger. Ma'am, you need to mind your own business. This doesn't concern you. It absolutely concerns me when I see injustice in my own neighborhood, Rose replied, standing as tall as her 5 feet 2 inches frame would allow. The smirking officer stepped closer to Rose, towering over her. And what would an old lady like you know about police work? Go home before you get yourself in trouble. Rose felt her heart racing, but she refused to be intimidated. I may be old, but I know disrespect when I see it. I'd like your badge numbers, all 3 of you. The atmosphere changed instantly. The tall officer's face contorted with anger. The smirking one let out a harsh laugh. You want our badge numbers? For what? Doing our job? How about instead, we check your ID? Maybe you don't live around here either. Maybe you're trespassing too. Rose clutched her Bible tighter. I most certainly am not. I've lived at 1423 Pearl Avenue for 43 years. Prove it, said the smirking officer, extending his hand. ID. Rose was stunned. I'm coming home from church. I don't carry my ID to church. The female officer finally spoke up. Guys, I don't think this is necessary. No, Katie, if she wants to play this game, let's play, said the tall officer. Ma'am, without ID, how do we know you belong here? Maybe you're confused. Maybe you're lost. Rose couldn't believe what she was hearing. I am not confused. I am perfectly sound of mind, and I live just down the street. Well, without ID, we can't verify that, said the smirking officer. For all we know, you could be trespassing or even experiencing some kind of mental episode. Thomas, who had been silent throughout this exchange, spoke up. Officers, please. This lady was just trying to help. My aunt will be home any minute. She can verify everything. The tall officer ignored him and turned back to Rose. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us to the station to verify your identity. Rose felt her knees go weak. What? That's absurd. I've done nothing wrong. Interfering with police business is wrong, said the smirking officer. And without ID, we need to verify who you are. The female officer looked increasingly uncomfortable but remained silent as her colleagues each took one of Rose's arms. Rose felt tears welling in her eyes, but she was determined not to let them fall. Not in front of these men. Take your hands off me right now, she said, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear. Ma'am, don't resist, or we'll have to add that to the charges, the tall officer warned. Rose looked at Thomas, who appeared horrified but helpless. Young man, she said firmly, in my purse is my phone. Please take it out and call my son. The smirking officer laughed. He's not touching anything. If you want to make a call, you can do it from the station. As they began leading her toward the police car, Rose raised her voice. His name is Henry Johnson. He's the head of the Civil Rights Division at Wilson and Brooks Law Firm in downtown. He'll want to know exactly what's happening here. For a brief moment, the officers hesitated. Wilson and Brooks was the most prestigious law firm in the state, known for taking on high-profile civil rights cases, and winning them. She's bluffing, the smirking officer said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. Rose straightened her back, wincing as her arthritis protested. I never bluff, young man. Now, you can either let me make that call right here, or you can explain to my son and his entire legal team why you're harassing an elderly woman coming home from church without cause. The three officers exchanged glances. The female officer spoke up. Maybe we should just let her call her son. If she's telling the truth. Fine, the tall officer cut her off. Make your call. But you're not going anywhere until we verify who you are. Rose nodded at Thomas, who hesitantly approached when the officers released her arms. He carefully took her purse and, under the watchful eyes of the police, retrieved her phone. It's locked, Thomas said, holding the phone out to Rose. With dignity, Rose took the phone, unlocked it, and pressed a contact labeled Henry, son. She put the phone on speaker as it rang. The atmosphere was tense as they all waited. After 3 rings, a deep, authoritative voice answered. Mom? Is everything okay? You never call after church. Rose took a deep breath. No, Henry, everything is not okay. I need your help right now. The officers' expressions changed as they heard the deep voice on the other end of the line. Rose held the phone firmly, her hand steady despite the situation. Mom, tell me what's happening. Henry's voice was calm but carried an underlying note of concern. I'm standing outside Patricia Wilson's house on Pearl and Magnolia. 3 police officers are here. They were questioning Patricia's nephew, and when I stopped to help, they started threatening to take me to the station because I don't have my ID with me. Rose's voice remained dignified, but Henry could detect the slight tremor in it. There was a brief silence on the other end. When Henry spoke again, his tone had changed. It was measured, precise, and unmistakably authoritative. Put me on speakerphone if I'm not already, Mom. You're on speaker, Henry. The officers can hear you. Officers, this is Henry Johnson. I'm the head of the Civil Rights Division at Wilson and Brooks Law Firm. I'd like your names and badge numbers, please. The tall officer shifted uncomfortably but maintained his stern expression. Sir, we're simply doing our job. We received a call about a suspicious person. I didn't ask for an explanation. I asked for your names and badge numbers, Henry interrupted, his voice sharp as a razor. And before you continue, I should inform you that I'm recording this call, and I'm already texting my colleague who lives 3 minutes from my mother's location. The female officer stepped forward. Officer Catherine Lee, badge number 5392. After a moment's hesitation, the other 2 followed suit. Officer James Winters, badge number 4871, said the tall one. Officer Daniel Peters, badge number 6023, muttered the smirking one, whose smile had completely vanished. Thank you, officers, Henry replied. Now, can you explain why you're detaining my mother, who is returning from church, and why you need to see her ID when she's literally a block from her home? Officer Winters cleared his throat. Sir, your mother intervened in an ongoing police matter and became confrontational. My mother became confrontational? Henry's voice carried disbelief. My 78-year-old mother who walks with a cane on bad days became confrontational with 3 armed officers? Please continue. I'm very interested in hearing this. Thomas, who had been standing silently nearby, spoke up. Sir, if I may, your mother was just trying to help me. I'm waiting for my aunt, and these officers approached me because someone reported a suspicious person. Your mother vouched for me, saying she knows my family. Henry's voice softened slightly. Thank you for that clarification. And you are? Thomas Wilson, sir. Patricia Wilson is my aunt. I see. And officers, instead of simply verifying this information by, I don't know, knocking on Ms. Wilson's door, you escalated the situation to the point of threatening to take my elderly mother to the station? The silence from the officers was telling. Are you still planning to detain my mother? Because I should inform you that I'm now on my way there, and so is my partner, who specializes in police misconduct cases. We'll be arriving with the Channel 7 news team, who happen to be working with us on a documentary about racial profiling in law enforcement. Rose couldn't help but smile slightly. There was no documentary, and she knew it. But Henry had always been quick on his feet. Officer Lee cleared her throat. Sir, there seems to be a misunderstanding. We never intended to detain your mother. We were simply trying to intimidate an elderly woman for standing up for what's right, Henry finished for her. I understand perfectly, Officer Lee. Just then, a car pulled into the driveway. A middle-aged black woman stepped out, looking confused at the scene before her. Thomas? What's going on? Why are there police here? She looked anxiously between her nephew and the officers. Aunt Patricia. Thomas rushed to her side. These officers stopped me while I was waiting for you. They thought I was suspicious or something. Patricia Wilson looked incredulously at the officers. My nephew, suspicious? He's been coming to my house every Sunday for years. Henry's voice came through the phone again. Ms. Wilson, this is Henry Johnson, Rose's son. It seems these officers didn't believe your nephew belonged in the neighborhood. Patricia's eyes widened in recognition. Henry? Rose's boy? The lawyer? She turned to Rose. Rose, are you okay? I'm fine, Patricia, Rose assured her, though her legs were beginning to ache from standing so long. Just a little misunderstanding, it seems. Officer Winters, sensing the situation slipping further from his control, attempted to regain authority. Ma'am, we were responding to a call. Save it, Patricia cut him off. I know exactly what kind of call you were responding to. The same kind that happens whenever any young black person spends more than 5 minutes in this neighborhood. Henry's voice cut through the tension. Officers, I'll be there in approximately 10 minutes. In the meantime, I expect you to apologize to my mother and to Mr. Wilson, and then you can be on your way. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to stay and explain your actions to me in person. The officers exchanged glances. Officer Lee stepped forward. Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Wilson, we apologize for the misunderstanding. We were simply responding to a call, but we could have handled the situation better. The other 2 officers mumbled similar apologies, though neither sounded particularly sincere. We'll be going now, Officer Winters said stiffly. Have a good day. As the officers retreated to their patrol cars, Rose kept the phone to her ear. They're leaving, Henry. Good. I'm still coming over, Mom. Don't go anywhere. I won't. Rose watched as the police cars pulled away from the curb. Her heart was still racing, but the fear was subsiding, replaced by a righteous anger that had sustained her through much worse over her lifetime. Patricia put an arm around her nephew's shoulders, then reached out to Rose with her free hand. Rose, come inside. You look like you could use a cup of tea. Rose nodded gratefully. That sounds wonderful, Patricia. And I believe I have some cookies to share. Inside Patricia's cozy living room, Rose sank into a floral-patterned armchair, finally allowing her tired legs to rest. Her hands trembled slightly as Patricia handed her a steaming cup of chamomile tea. Here you go, Rose. This will help calm your nerves, Patricia said, placing a small plate of Rose's church cookies on the coffee table. Thomas sat quietly on the sofa, still processing what had happened. Ms. Johnson, I can't thank you enough for stopping. Most people would have just walked by. Rose took a sip of tea before responding. Child, in my 78 years, I've learned that walking by is what allows these things to keep happening. My mama taught me that, and I taught it to my Henry. Patricia squeezed Rose's shoulder gently. Speaking of Henry, he sounded like he meant business. Those officers' faces when they heard who he was. She chuckled, though the humor was tinged with the seriousness of the situation. Henry has always fought for what's right, Rose said with unmistakable pride. Even as a little boy, he couldn't stand to see anyone treated unfairly. Used to come home with a bloody nose sometimes, standing up for the smaller kids at school. The doorbell rang, and Thomas went to answer it. Moments later, Henry Johnson strode into the living room. At 6'2" with broad shoulders and a commanding presence, he filled the doorway before entering. Despite the Sunday afternoon, he wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, as if he'd been heading to an important meeting when he got Rose's call. "Mom," he said, his professional demeanor softening as he knelt beside Rose's chair and took her hands in his. "Are you okay? Did they touch you? Did they hurt you?" Rose shook her head. "I'm fine, just a little shaken up. Nothing your mama can't handle." She squeezed his hands reassuringly. Henry wasn't convinced. His eyes scanned her as if looking for invisible injuries. "Your blood pressure, Mom. Did you take your medication today?" "Yes, Henry, this morning with breakfast, like always," Rose said patiently. "Now stop fussing. I'm not the one you need to be worried about. This young man is the one they were harassing first." She gestured toward Thomas. Henry stood and turned to Thomas, extending his hand. "Henry Johnson. Thank you for looking out for my mother." Thomas shook his hand, looking somewhat starstruck. "Thomas Wilson, sir. And honestly, it was your mother who looked out for me. I've seen you on TV, arguing those big civil rights cases. You're kind of a legend at my law school." Henry smiled modestly. "Just doing my job." He turned to Patricia. "Ms. Wilson, I apologize for meeting under these circumstances. My mother has mentioned you many times over the years. Call me Patricia, please. And there's nothing to apologize for. It's those officers who should be apologizing, properly, not those half-hearted mutterings they gave before slinking away." Henry's face hardened. "Don't worry. They'll be doing more than apologizing." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through some notes he'd apparently taken during the drive over. "I've already spoken to my colleague, David, who's with our Police Accountability Task Force. We're filing a formal complaint tonight." Rose watched her son with a mixture of pride and concern. "Henry, maybe we should just let it go. They didn't actually take me in or anything." Henry looked at his mother intently. "Mom, they threatened to detain you for walking home from church and standing up for what's right. If they do that to you, a respected elder in this community, what do you think they do to young men like Thomas when there's no one watching?" The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Thomas looked down at his hands, and Patricia pressed her lips together in a thin line. Rose nodded slowly. "You're right, son. You always are about these things." Henry sat down on the sofa across from his mother. "I received something interesting on my way over here. A text from a client who lives 2 doors down from Mrs. Wilson. Apparently, he has a security camera that captured the entire incident." Patricia raised her eyebrows. "Mr. Chen? He installed those cameras last year after someone vandalized his garden gnomes." "Yes," Henry confirmed. "He's sending me the footage now. He said he was watching through his window but was afraid to come out because of how the officers were acting." Thomas leaned forward, hope flickering in his eyes. "So we have evidence? Real evidence of how they treated us?" Henry nodded. "It appears so. And there's more. While I was driving over, I made a few calls. Turns out Officers Winters and Peters have had multiple complaints filed against them in the past 3 years. Nothing that stuck, of course, but a pattern is emerging." "That doesn't surprise me one bit," Patricia huffed. "Last summer, I saw those same officers giving Mrs. Rivera's son a hard time when he was washing his car in their driveway. Claimed they'd gotten a call about suspicious activity then too. Henry's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his expression changed to one of grim satisfaction. Mr. Chen came through with the video. He tapped his screen a few times and then held it up. The footage showed the entire scene from a high angle, the officers surrounding Thomas, Rose's intervention, and the escalation that followed. The audio was faint but clear enough to make out most of what was said. When the video ended, the room was silent again, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a sense of potential justice that hadn't been there before. "This changes everything," Henry said, his voice quiet but intense. "Mom, with your permission, I want to pursue this. Not just a complaint, but a full investigation into these officers and their department's practices in this neighborhood." Rose looked at her son, then at Thomas and Patricia. She thought about all the times she'd heard similar stories from church members, neighbors, and friends. All the times when there hadn't been anyone to help, anyone to witness, anyone to call. "You have my permission, Henry," she said firmly. "It's time someone held them accountable." Henry nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'll need statements from all of you. And Mom, I want you to see Dr. Lewis tomorrow, just to make sure your blood pressure is okay after all this excitement." 2 days later, Rose sat in Henry's spacious office at Wilson and Brooks law firm. The wall behind his desk was lined with framed diplomas, awards, and photos of Henry with various dignitaries and civil rights leaders. Large windows offered a stunning view of the city skyline, a physical reminder of how far her son had risen. Rose fidgeted with her purse strap as Henry reviewed the documents spread across his polished mahogany desk. The doctor had given her a clean bill of health yesterday, though he'd advised her to avoid stressful situations, advice that seemed impossible to follow at the moment. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Henry asked, looking up from the papers. The concern in his eyes reminded Rose of when he was a boy, always worrying about her working too hard at her 2 jobs. "I'm fine, son. Dr. Lewis said so himself." She straightened in her chair. "What matters now is what we're doing about those officers." A gentle knock on the door preceded the entrance of a young woman with rectangular glasses and a tablet in hand. "Mr. Johnson, Chief Williams is here for your meeting." Henry nodded. "Thank you, Amara. Send him in, please." Rose's eyebrows shot up. "The police chief?" "Henry, you didn't tell me." Before she could finish, a man in a crisp police uniform entered the office. Chief Raymond Williams was in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair and a stern demeanor that softened slightly when he saw Rose. "Mr. Johnson," he said, extending his hand to Henry. "Mrs. Johnson," he added with a respectful nod to Rose. Henry gestured to a chair. "Thank you for coming, Chief Williams. I appreciate you making the time." The chief sat down, his posture rigid. When the head of the Civil Rights Division at Wilson and Brooks requests a meeting, wise men make time. There was a hint of wariness in his voice. "Especially when it concerns an incident involving my officers." Henry's expression remained professionally neutral. "I'll get straight to the point. 2 days ago, 3 of your officers, Winters, Peters, and Lee, approached a young man waiting for his aunt outside her home. When my mother intervened, they threatened to detain her for not carrying identification while walking home from church in her own neighborhood." Chief Williams cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the officers' report. They claim they were responding to a call about a suspicious person and that your mother became confrontational." "That's not what happened," Rose interjected, her voice firm despite her nervousness at addressing the chief directly. Henry slid a tablet across the desk. "This is security footage from a neighbor's camera. It shows the entire incident, including audio. I suggest you watch it before we continue." The chief's expression remained impassive as he picked up the tablet and pressed play. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the faint audio from the recording. Rose watched the chief's face carefully, noticing the slight tightening around his eyes and mouth as the video progressed. When it ended, Chief Williams set the tablet down slowly. "This does not align with the officer's report." "No, it doesn't," Henry agreed. "And it's not just this incident. We've compiled evidence of a pattern of similar behavior from Officers Winters and Peters, particularly in predominantly black neighborhoods." Henry handed the chief a folder. 15 complaints in 3 years. All dismissed or buried. All involving harassment or excessive force against black residents who were doing nothing wrong. Chief Williams flipped through the folder, his frown deepening. Some of these claims were investigated and found to be without merit. By your department's Internal Affairs Division, Henry pointed out. Not exactly an impartial investigation. Rose watched the exchange in silence, marveling at her son's calm authority. This was a different Henry from the one who had knelt beside her chair at Patricia's house. This was the renowned attorney whose name made powerful people nervous. "What exactly are you looking for here, Mr. Johnson?" the chief asked finally. "I assume you didn't invite me to your office just to show me this." Henry leaned forward slightly. "I want a full investigation into these officers' conduct, independently reviewed. I want disciplinary action based on the findings. And I want departmental reforms to address the broader issues of racial profiling and harassment in our community." The chief's expression hardened. "That's a lot to ask based on one incident." "It's not one incident," Rose said quietly but firmly. "It's just one that happened to be caught on camera. One that happened to the mother of someone with the power to do something about it." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Chief Williams looked at Rose with new respect and perhaps a hint of discomfort. Henry continued. "We're prepared to file a civil rights lawsuit and release the footage to the media. Channel 7 is particularly interested, especially given their recent series on police accountability." The chief's jaw tightened. "That would damage the department's relationship with the community and the morale of my officers." "With all due respect, Chief," Henry replied, "that relationship is already damaged, and officers who behave this way should have their morale questioned." Chief Williams sat back, considering his options. After a long moment, he spoke. "I'll launch an investigation. Independently reviewed, as you requested. And I'll personally review the other complaints you've compiled." "And the officers?" Henry pressed. "Administrative leave, effective immediately, pending the investigation's outcome." Henry nodded, satisfied with this first step. "We'll be monitoring the investigation closely. I'd also like to discuss forming a community oversight committee to address the broader issues. Perhaps we could schedule another meeting next week?" The chief stood, recognizing the dismissal. "I'll have my office contact yours." He turned to Rose. "Mrs. Johnson, I apologize for your experience. It's not what we strive for at the department." As the door closed behind the chief, Rose reached across the desk and squeezed her son's hand. "You were magnificent, Henry. Just magnificent." Henry's professional demeanor softened. "I learned from the best, Mom. You taught me never to back down when it matters." Rose smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Your father would be so proud to see the man you've become." Henry squeezed her hand in return. "This is just the beginning, Mom. We're going to make real changes. Not just for you and Thomas, but for everyone in our community." 1 week later, Rose sat at her kitchen table surrounded by familiar faces. Patricia and Thomas Wilson were there, along with Mr. Chen, whose security camera had captured the incident. Several other neighbors had joined them, Mrs. Rivera and her son Carlos, the Johnson family from down the street, and Pastor Green from Rose's church. Henry stood at the head of the table, his suit jacket draped over a chair, sleeves rolled up as he explained what had happened since their meeting with Chief Williams. The internal investigation is moving forward, Henry said, passing around copies of a document. These are the preliminary findings. As expected, Officers Winters and Peters have a history of similar complaints, especially in predominantly black and Hispanic neighborhoods. Mrs. Rivera nodded grimly. Like I told you about what happened to Carlos last summer. They claimed he looked suspicious washing his own car in our driveway. Exactly, Henry confirmed. And we've identified 12 other incidents in the past 2 years alone. Most were never formally reported because people were afraid or didn't think anything would come of it. Thomas leaned forward. What about Officer Lee? She seemed uncomfortable with what was happening. Henry nodded. Good observation, Thomas. Officer Lee has a cleaner record. In fact, she's cooperating with the investigation. She's admitted that Winters and Peters have a pattern of targeting people of color for random stops and questioning. Pastor Green, a distinguished man in his 60s, folded his hands on the table. So what happens now, Henry? We've seen investigations before that led nowhere. Rose watched her son closely. His expression was determined but cautious. This time is different, Henry said. We have video evidence, multiple witnesses, and an officer willing to speak up. But most importantly, we're not letting this be just about one incident. We're pushing for systemic change. He turned to a fresh page in his notepad. That's why I've asked you all here today. We're forming a Community Police Accountability Council. With your permission, I'd like each of you to be founding members. The room buzzed with surprised murmurs. Rose felt a surge of pride watching her son take charge, turning their painful experience into something constructive. What exactly would this council do? Mr. Chen asked, adjusting his glasses. 3 main things, Henry explained. First, we'll establish a civilian review process for police complaints, independent from the department's internal affairs. Second, we'll work with the department on training reforms to address implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. And third, we'll create a community outreach program to rebuild trust between officers and residents. Carlos Rivera, a college student who rarely spoke at community gatherings, raised his hand hesitantly. Will the police department actually listen to us? What kind of authority would this council have? It was a good question, and Rose saw the others nodding in agreement. Henry smiled. Another excellent point. I've already discussed this with Chief Williams and the mayor's office. They've agreed to recognize the council officially and give us an advisory role in department policies. Plus, my firm will provide legal support to ensure the department honors its commitments. The atmosphere in the room shifted from skepticism to cautious optimism. Rose had lived long enough to know that change rarely came easily, but she also knew her son's determination. I have something to add, Rose said, speaking up for the first time. All eyes turned to her. This isn't just about police reform. It's about our neighborhood too. For too long, we've kept to ourselves when we see something wrong happening to our neighbors. She looked around the table, meeting each person's gaze. Mr. Chen saw what was happening to Thomas and me, but he was afraid to come outside. I understand why, it was the sensible thing to do. But imagine if 5 or 6 neighbors had come out together. Those officers would have behaved differently. Pastor Green nodded. Rose is right. We need to look out for each other more. Build a stronger community. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need, Henry agreed. This council can be about more than just holding the police accountable. It can be about empowering our community. Patricia reached over and squeezed Rose's hand. I'm in. After what you did for Thomas, standing up when nobody else would, the least I can do is stand with you now. One by one, everyone at the table voiced their support. Mr. Chen promised to help other homeowners install security cameras. Pastor Green offered the church as a meeting place for the council. The Johnson family, who ran a local print shop, volunteered to create materials for the community outreach program. As Rose watched her neighbors planning and organizing, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a genuine sense of hope. The incident that had left her shaken and angry was transforming into a catalyst for positive change. Later, as people began to leave, Thomas lingered behind to speak with Rose privately. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice earnest, "I never properly thanked you for what you did that day. Most people would have walked by, but you stopped. You risked yourself for a stranger." Rose patted his hand. "Not a stranger, child. A neighbor. And that's what neighbors should do." Thomas smiled. "I've made a decision. I was planning to join a big corporate law firm after graduation next year, but after all this, I want to work in civil rights law instead. Like your son." Rose felt tears welling in her eyes. "Thomas, that's wonderful. Henry's firm has an excellent internship program, you know." "Actually," Henry said, joining them, "I already offered him a summer position. This young man has a bright future in civil rights law." As Thomas left with a spring in his step, Henry sat beside his mother. "You started something big, Mom. Something important." Rose shook her head. "We started it together, son. And we'll finish it together too." 3 weeks later, Rose sat in the back row of the city council chambers, watching her son address the packed room. The space buzzed with energy. Community members, reporters, and city officials all gathered for what the local newspaper had dubbed a watershed moment for police accountability in their city. Henry stood at the podium, poised and professional in his charcoal suit. Behind him sat Chief Williams, looking considerably less comfortable, along with the mayor and several council members. "Ladies and gentlemen," Henry began, his voice carrying throughout the chamber without the need to raise it. 3 weeks ago, my mother, a 78-year-old church-going woman, was threatened with detention by police officers while walking home from Sunday service, simply because she stood up for a young man being harassed in her neighborhood. Rose felt eyes turning to her, but she kept her gaze steady on her son. She had worn her best dress today, a deep purple with matching hat, the same outfit she wore to church on special occasions. "What happened to my mother and to Thomas Wilson was not an isolated incident," Henry continued. "It was part of a pattern of misconduct that has gone unchecked for too long. But today, we're not here to dwell on past injustices. We're here to ensure they never happen again." Henry gestured to a group seated in the front row, the founding members of the Community Police Accountability Council, including Patricia, Thomas, Pastor Green, and the others who had gathered in Rose's kitchen weeks earlier. "I present to you the framework for the Community Police Accountability Council, developed in collaboration with Chief Williams and the Mayor's office. This independent body of citizens will serve as a bridge between our community and those sworn to protect it." On a large screen behind him, a PowerPoint presentation displayed the council's structure and responsibilities. Rose had watched Henry work on this presentation late into the night, revising and refining until every word was perfect. Chief Williams approached the podium next. His usual commanding presence seemed subdued as he cleared his throat. "What happened to Mrs. Johnson and Mr. Wilson was unacceptable," he began, surprising Rose with his directness. "As Chief of Police, I take full responsibility for the actions of my officers. The internal investigation has been completed, and I want to share the results publicly." The room fell silent as the chief continued. "Officers Winters and Peters have been terminated from the force, effective immediately. Their misconduct violated department policy, community trust, and the very oath they took to serve and protect." A murmur rippled through the audience. Rose felt Patricia squeeze her hand in excitement. "Additionally," the chief went on, "Officer Lee has been reassigned to assist with our new training initiatives, using her cooperation in this case as a teaching tool for other officers." Henry returned to the podium. "We appreciate the chief's decisive action. But addressing individual misconduct is only the first step. Today, we're implementing 3 major reforms. He held up one finger. First, all officers will undergo enhanced training on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques, designed in partnership with our community council. A second finger joined the first. Second, the department will implement body cameras for all officers, with footage accessible to the Independent Review Board in cases of alleged misconduct. And finally, a third finger. Third, we're establishing the Rose Johnson Community Policing Initiative, focusing on building relationships between officers and residents through regular neighborhood meetings, youth programs, and community service projects. Rose gasped softly at hearing her name. Henry hadn't told her about this part. She felt tears gathering in her eyes as the audience applauded. The mayor stepped forward next, shaking Henry's hand for the cameras before speaking. The city council has unanimously approved funding for these initiatives. We're committed to making our police department a model for community-oriented policing. As the formal presentation concluded, reporters surged forward with questions. Henry handled them with practiced ease, directing some to Chief Williams and others to members of the new council. Pastor Green made his way to Rose's side. "Well, Rose, it looks like your stand that Sunday is changing the whole city." Rose shook her head modestly. "It wasn't just me. It took all of us, and it took my Henry knowing how to turn a moment into a movement." Speaking of movements, the pastor said with a smile, "I hear the story has gone national. Henry was on that morning news show yesterday, and Thomas was interviewed for that law journal. People in other cities are asking how they can start similar councils." Before Rose could respond, she noticed a young officer making her way through the crowd, Officer Lee, looking quite different out of uniform in a simple blazer and slacks. The officer approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Johnson? I've been wanting to speak with you privately." Rose nodded, curious. "Of course, Officer Lee. Catherine, please." The young woman sat in the empty chair beside Rose. "I wanted to apologize personally for what happened that day. I should have spoken up sooner when I saw things going wrong." Rose studied the officer's face, seeing genuine remorse. It takes courage to stand against your colleagues, especially when they're doing wrong. You found that courage eventually, with the investigation. Catherine nodded. "Not soon enough. But I promise you, I'll be using my voice from now on. Chief Williams has asked me to lead some of the new training programs, to share what I learned from this experience." Pastor Green excused himself discreetly, leaving the two women to talk. "You know," Rose said thoughtfully, "that's how real change happens. Not just from the outside pushing in, but from the inside pushing out as well." Catherine smiled. "That's exactly what your son said when he recommended me for the position." Rose looked across the room at Henry, still fielding questions with patient determination. "My son is a wise man. He gets that from his father," she added with a wink. For the first time in weeks, Rose felt the tension she'd been carrying begin to truly dissolve. What had started as a frightening confrontation on a Sunday afternoon was blossoming into something powerful and healing for the entire community. 6 months later, Rose sat on her front porch, enjoying the warm spring breeze. Her rocking chair creaked gently as she watched the neighborhood children playing across the street. So much had changed since that fateful Sunday afternoon. The doorbell rang, and Rose carefully made her way inside. When she opened the door, she was greeted by Thomas Wilson's beaming face. "Mrs. Johnson. I hope I'm not interrupting your afternoon." He stood there in a crisp new suit, looking every bit the young professional. "Thomas. What a lovely surprise." Rose ushered him in. "Henry mentioned you were doing well at the firm, but he didn't tell me you were coming by today." Thomas followed her into the living room, where photos of Rose's family lined the walls alongside recent newspaper clippings about the Community Police Accountability Council. "I wanted to share some news with you in person," Thomas said, barely containing his excitement. I've been accepted to 3 law schools, including Howard University's civil rights program. Rose clasped her hands together. Oh, Thomas. That's wonderful news. Your aunt must be so proud. She is, Thomas nodded. But I wanted to tell you personally because, well, you're the reason I'm on this path now. That day changed everything for me. Rose gestured for him to sit. Would you like some tea? I just made a fresh pot. As Rose poured tea into her good china cups, the ones usually reserved for special occasions, Thomas continued. The summer internship at Henry's firm has been incredible. I've been helping with the community council work, and last week, I got to sit in on a major civil rights case. Rose handed him a cup. Henry says you have a natural talent for the law. He's not one to give praise lightly, you know. Thomas smiled. Coming from him, that means everything. He paused, setting his cup down. But there's another reason I came by today. The community council is holding a special ceremony next Saturday, and we'd like you to be the guest of honor. Rose raised an eyebrow. Guest of honor? What for? We're celebrating 6 months of the Rose Johnson Initiative, Thomas explained. The results have been remarkable. Civilian complaints against officers are down 60%. Community satisfaction with police has increased dramatically. And 5 other cities have launched similar programs based on our model. Rose shook her head modestly. That's Henry's doing, not mine. I just stood up when I saw something wrong. That's exactly why we want to honor you, Mrs. Johnson. You showed all of us that one person standing up can create real change. Thomas leaned forward earnestly. The mayor will be there, along with Chief Williams and representatives from those other cities looking to implement similar programs. Before Rose could respond, the front door opened, and Henry walked in, carrying a briefcase and a bouquet of fresh flowers. Mom, I brought your favorites. He stopped short when he saw Thomas. Thomas. I didn't know you were stopping by. I came to tell your mother about the ceremony, Thomas explained, standing to shake Henry's hand. Henry placed the flowers in a vase on the coffee table. I was going to surprise her with that news myself, but I see you beat me to it. He smiled good-naturedly. Well, no one told me I was being honored for anything, Rose said, giving her son a pointed look. Henry sat beside his mother on the sofa. We wanted it to be a surprise. It's not just a ceremony, Mom. We're launching a scholarship fund in your name for students pursuing careers in civil rights law or community advocacy. Rose felt tears threatening. A scholarship? Henry, that's too much. It's not nearly enough, Henry replied softly. Do you know what Chief Williams told me yesterday? He said that our accountability model is being considered for statewide implementation. The governor's office reached out to discuss it. Thomas nodded eagerly. And I've been helping compile the data for the 6-month report. Every metric shows improvement, not just in police behavior, but in community engagement too. Rose looked between the 2 men, one her son whom she'd raised to fight for justice, the other a young man whose life had intersected with hers by chance on that Sunday afternoon. Both now dedicated to ensuring others wouldn't face what they had experienced. The ceremony is being held at the community center, Henry added. Pastor Green insisted on giving the opening prayer, and Patricia is organizing the reception afterward. The whole neighborhood is talking about it, Thomas said. Mr. Chen keeps telling everyone who comes into his store that he knows you personally. Rose laughed softly. That man is too much. His security camera started all of this. No, Mom, Henry said gently. You started all of this. When you saw something wrong and refused to walk by. Everything else, the video, my involvement, the council, the reforms, it all started because you stopped that day. Rose glanced at the newspaper clipping framed on her wall. The headline read, Rose Johnson Initiative shows promising results in first 6 months. Beside it was a photo of Rose cutting a ribbon at the opening of the new Community Police Outreach Center. You know, she said thoughtfully, my mother used to tell me that God puts us in certain places at certain times for a reason. I never understood what she meant until that Sunday. Thomas nodded. I think about that a lot. What if you had taken a different route home that day? What if you had just kept walking? But she didn't, Henry said with pride. That's who my mother is. That's who she's always been. Rose reached out, taking one of their hands in each of hers. What matters isn't what I did that day. What matters is what you're both doing every day since, building bridges, creating systems that work for everyone, making sure other Roses and other Thomases are treated with dignity. As the afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across the living room, Rose felt a profound sense of peace. The fear and anger from that Sunday confrontation had transformed into something powerful and healing, not just for her, but for an entire community. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important stand you take isn't the one that makes headlines. It's the one that inspires others to take their own stand, creating a ripple effect that continues long after that first brave moment has passed.